Today, we are very pleased to have with us visual story editor Marc Prüst, and he will, in this webinar, share his expertise on how to edit your photography. And during this hour, he will also explore these questions regarding editing and sequencing, and hopefully also more. And I think many of us as photographers ask questions when we edit our work. How do we do it? How do we sequence? What is the kind of rules, or are there any rules? And I think Marc is going to give us at least some answers to these quite difficult questions, especially for the photographers. Marc is a researcher and photography educator based in Amsterdam. And he has developed a method for creating photographic projects that enables photographers to develop their concepts and prepare the shoot and edit and market their work after. He has published 2 books on this method, Tell Your Story and Edit Your Story. And Marc also gives workshops and masterclasses. He holds guest lectures like this one, and also writes on photography. And Marc teaches visual economy in the, do I say it right, Marc? Moholy
Nudge University of Art and
University of Arts and Design. Yeah.
In Budapest.
So,
yes, indeed.
Without further ado, I think I'm going to give the floor to Marc, who will have prepared a presentation, and we're going to also discuss these questions and others after. So the floor is yours, Marc.
Great. Thanks, Espen. And thanks, everyone, for joining this webinar. I'm very happy to see so many people from all over the world. It's quite impressive. Let me share my desktop. Hold on. It's always interesting whether this works the first time.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think you're seeing the right screen. So welcome to this presentation. Indeed, as Espen said, my name is Marc Prüst. I'm a research and photography curator. And I would like to present you my latest book project, Edit Your Story, which is really indeed about how to edit stories. What is a story, and what different ways of sequencing you can find, or you can use when creating photographic stories. I would like to start by explaining to you why I actually wrote this book and how I went about writing it. And I will try to explain why I think it can be very helpful for photographers to use the ideas and the concepts that I describe in this little book. I should start by saying that for me, photography is a medium. It's a way to communicate. You, as a photographer, you have something to say, and you just happen to use photography, perhaps combined with text, film, or any other ways, but you use photography to relay a message, to relay what you want to say to your audience. It's not the only way that we can use photography, of course, but for me, this is what interests me the most. It's less concerned with the process, but more what photography does in relationship to an audience. And this idea of photography as a medium implies that a project is only successful to the extent that it is actually understood by its audience. It implies that a practitioner, you have something to say, that you know what it is you want to get across. And that may sound like an open door, very obvious, but I've learned from my own experience as a researcher, as a writer, but also while working with photographers, that's actually really hard to understand what it is you want to say yourself. And it's really even harder to put that then into words. It's really difficult to wrap your head around what you're doing, why you're doing it, but these are really important questions to answer. My previous book project, and Espen already mentioned it shortly, was Tell Your Story, which was in fact a research project into business models for photographers. But it was also about how to describe a photographic project as you work on it. And I call that the premise of your project. And for me, the premise is like a conceptual description of a photographic project, and it mentions or it includes what images you want to show, in which story format, and very important, why the story matters. And I think you can use that sentence almost as a personal reminder of why you do a project, what pictures you need, and why you take these pictures and how you can use them to tell the story you want to tell. But still, you need to put that into words, right? And you need to kind of identify what story format you then want to use. You've taken your photographs, you know what it is you want to say, you know why it's important, but then you have to bring them together into some kind of sequence and some kind of structure. And that led me, when I finished this book and I started talking about it and giving these kind of presentations and working with photographers, it led me to think about what is a story actually? How does a story relate to reality? What is the role of storytelling? How can you actually create a story? And what I understood is that indeed stories are creations. Stories don't just exist out there. They need to be created by you, by storytellers. And the idea that I think would really help me was to realize that narration is a really crucial element in storytelling. The idea that in order to tell a story, you have to organize information. You have to impose a structure on related and perhaps seemingly unrelated events, places, and people. They have to come together somehow. And to tell a story, to impose this structure onto the reality that's in front of us, you need to prioritize. You need to select some elements, you need to deselect other elements in order to bring the story together. But it's the story, the storyline, the message, whatever you want to call it, that can help you identify the criteria. Basically, the story is the criteria by which to decide if an image should be used to tell your story or should not be used to tell your story. Developing this idea of what is a story and how can you tell stories further led me to understand that a story actually consists of three different elements. You've got content, you've got structure, and you've got context. So if you think about a story that is told through a book, but it can be an exhibition, it could be a magazine, it could be a newspaper, or whatever format or platform you happen to use, somehow these three elements play a role in the telling of your story. Yeah, you kind of have to identify these three elements. So if we talk about indeed a book, the content of the book, the contents of the story is carried by the images, mostly. Maybe you use text, maybe you use graphics, maybe you use other elements, but those elements that tell the story build the content. Then you need to organize that context into a structure. That's the story format. And then there is the context. And the context, in the case of a book, is obviously the design, but also the choice of paper, whether you have a soft cover or a hard cover, the font size of your text. Really important elements. But what I'm focusing on in Edit Your Story is really that structure. How can you organize your photographs? How can you relate the photographs to the other elements, such as captions or other text? And how do they interact? How do you bring them together? So for me, structure is the story format, or it's not actually totally true. Story format is one very important element of structure. I hope that makes sense. If you think about literature, just to make that example, a story structure could be a haiku, this Japanese form of poetry, or a diary, or a tragedy, or a play, or a novel. Different structures in which the content, the words, the sentences are organized. With these realizations, the premise that we have a structure that it's important to analyze the structure of photo stories, and that it can be a helpful tool to also not just look at a project from in hindsight, but actually in terms of creating a project. I've started to look through many photo books, exhibitions, magazine publications. I did this through the pandemic, so I had a lot of time on my hands to actually go through all my books at home again, and even, you know, order some new ones, and try to identify and categorize basically all these different formats that I found and that I was confronted with. And eventually, while going through all these formats, all these stories, all these amazing books, I came up with 11 distinct story formats, and I tried to then name them and define them with a particular and specific distinct definition. So these are the 11 different formats. I mean, I'll go through each of them very shortly, because 11 is a lot to kind of go into detail one by one. Some of these formats are quite well known. I think a lot of us have heard or are familiar with the road trip. I mean, the Americans, several other photographers have used the road trip as a format. So it's not a, you know, this is not a completely new thing. Also, typology is one that I think is actually quite common, and a lot of people will have heard of it. Visual essay, one, I mean, made famous obviously by Life magazine and other magazines from that, you know, era, the 50s, the 60s, maybe a little bit into the 70s of the previous decade. But how does a visual essay relate to a narrative? What's the difference? Or what is the difference between a typology and a portfolio? That is what I've tried to identify by creating these very distinct definitions in this little booklet, Edit Your Story. So these are another 4 of these story formats, and these are 3 more. And my point is that I don't want to look at a book and say and kind of have this big discussion to define where does the book fit. Oh, this is a narrative and therefore it is better than this, which is a portfolio. That's not the point at all. What I've been trying to do is to actually set up a toolkit for photographers that can help them, can assist them in identifying these structures that can help you edit your story. Because I think when I edit photo books, I've edited several photo books with photographers, I've curated exhibitions by myself, but also very much in conjunction with the photographer. The challenge is you end up with a bunch of photographs, and you want to put them into a structure. You want to bring them together. You have to decide which photographs you're going to use and which photographs you don't want to use. And most people look for their best photographs. Obviously, when you start making an edit, you try to identify those images that you think are your best pictures, and that makes a lot of sense. But I've come to realize that it's not about identifying your most beautiful or your best pictures when you start editing. When you start editing, and I tell this to photographers quite often, remember, the story is not in your pictures. The story is in your head. You need to first identify the story and then look for those photographs that tell the story best. And hopefully these 11 formats can help you to find a way to structure those images, to identify the sequencing, but also the choice of images. There's not one way of doing this. This is only my experience, my background that has led me to come up with this structure and these words. And I think it's I would like you to look at all these words and all these definitions as a tool, and not as a way to classify and to keep things very strict. But hopefully this tool can help to offer structure when you're sitting with all your photographs and you want to edit your images into a story that communicates what you want to say. it's amazing. The best stories, the most beautiful books, the most impressive exhibitions don't follow the rules. They break the rules and they defy conventions and categories. But at the same time, I think you can only break the rules once you know them. And that's why I've come up with my rule book. And it's only one rule book, and this is not the rule book. I definitely do not hope so. I hope that more people will come up with different rules and systems, so we can start discussing, and everybody can identify what works for them particularly. You can purchase this book. It's a very small book. It's both in English and in Dutch for $14.95 if you follow the web link on this through this QR code. The Tell Your Story book is no longer available in print, unfortunately, but you can download it as a PDF if you follow this website and you leave your name and email address. You can download the book and the manual on how to build up a photographic project. So I hope that was clear. I hope I've given you some kind of information. Thank you very much for your attention. And Espen, I think I hope there's some questions from the audience, or maybe you have some questions for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, as I worked 20 years, many of them as a picture editor. So for me, this is really interesting and a good way. I read your book some days ago and went through all the categories, and I think you're right. It's you know, as a photographer especially, and you see that over and over again, it's really hard for many photographers to do their own edits. It's one thing is to do the good pictures and find the story, but I think the hardest thing for a lot of photographers is actually to do a proper edit. And by sitting in different photo competitions and other things, you can see clearly that that's very often what makes a story bad. It's not the pictures itself. It's very often the edit that ruins what could be a good story. So from your perspective, I'm a photographer. I've been out doing a project. It can be a week, it can be 2 months, and I have like 200 pictures. I really love all of them, and I want all of them to be in this project. Where would you start if you were me and you were gonna start to edit this work? What would you look for first? I mean, this is just you know, it's not.
Yeah. No, I totally understand your question. Because it happens that photographers come to my office here close to Amsterdam and say, I have a project and can you help me edit? And they bring all their pictures. And the first thing that I do is, okay, sit down, have a coffee, and answer this question. What have you been doing and why have you been doing it? What are you looking for? As I said, your story is not in your pictures. Your story is in your head. And I think it's crucial before you start looking at the photographs is to identify what's the story that you want to tell and how do you want to tell it. And that seems so obvious. And I think through experience, it becomes a bit easier. But I think the first time you're up against this task, to really put into words what it is you're doing and why you're doing it and why people should care. Because that has nothing to do with the fact that you're a photographer and that you had a very amazing experience shooting the story. That's great. And that's really, you know, I have nothing against it. I mean, I'm happy that you enjoyed it. But in the end, it's about the audience. And the audience doesn't know you, doesn't know your experience, but only sees the photographs. So the story has to be contained within that. But by merely choosing what you think are the best photographs, you end up with a catalog, your best photograph. It's a way of doing it. And if you're a very famous photographer, I mean, I love catalogs by André Kertész and Henri Cartier-Bresson. They're amazing books. But generally, if I want to see a project, I want to see how you tell the story and what the story is. And that's rarely through your best photographs. And to move beyond that, I think the first step is to actually think about what it is you want to say and to try and put it into words.
There's some questions here. One is, what is the difference between a project and a story?
Well, I mean, I think it's there's so many ways to define this. For me, a project is the whole activity. It's going out to the shoot. It's making the connections. It's finding the money. It's building the relationships. And from that, different stories can emerge. So you can do a book, you can do an exhibition, you can do a magazine publication, you can do a talk at an event. They're all part of the same project. But it could be that the story you tell through the book and the story you tell through the exhibition and the story you tell through the entry you do for the competition, they're not completely different, but they might touch upon different things. So they're still part of the same project, but you might be telling different stories or storylines. That's one way to define it. But I realize everybody will put their own terminology here.
Yeah. And I also have a question from Wahab. I have a question about sequence. Do you prefer to work with dynamic or static sequence?
That's an interesting question. What do you mean? What is the difference between the two? Do you know the difference? Can you explain the difference to me, Espen, or should we go back to the person who asked the question?
I'm not sure what the meaning of dynamic or static is. That a static is more like a very like single images put together in a way, while dynamic is basically what you write about in the book, that pictures work.
Yeah, and I think
the whole story
work together. Well, I think I'm not sure if this is the right answer to the right question, but for me, photography is a serial medium, and I love single photographs. I mean, there's several single photographs on my wall, and it's great. But for me, photography is unique that it is a serial medium, that you can put different images together, and that you can narrate through those images. I mean, there's a reason why photo books and photo exhibitions consist of more than just one photograph, because it's inherent in the medium that you can create sequences, that you can put things together with multiple images. And I think that is why I would prefer, I have a preference myself with with the sequencing of photographs and multiple image stories. But again, I'm not sure if that answers this particular question.
Wahab, if that was not the answer you were looking for, please specify a bit more what your question is. I also have one from Jürgen. Thank you, Mark. What is the main challenge you have found when you want a story to be meaningful?
Ooh. I think one challenge is to identify why it matters to your audience, and to get that across. I mean, I think it's one point of identifying why it matters to you, and I think that's really important, because if you don't have that personal motivation, or the story doesn't even matter to you, it's going to be very difficult to convince your audience to be connected and to be concerned. But obviously that is still a challenge, and then finding the right platform to show your work, where you actually have the opportunity to reach out to that audience, I think is one of the main challenges of the industry today.
And Eric Matthey is asking, editing images down is one thing, but the sequencing becomes a completely different matter. I've met some great editors, but it seems like photo sequencers are a completely different breed. Do you have any thoughts about how to approach the sequencing of images in a presentation?
Well, that's where I would definitely refer to edit your story. It really is about sequencing. How can you sequence images meaningfully? And it really depends on the format that you use. For example, in a portfolio or in a typology, the actual sequence of your photographs might not even change the contents of the story that much. So of course it matters, it's important, and it's relevant to think about it. But I think it's also important to realize for photographers that sometimes the sequence will not really change how your photographs will be viewed. that's very different when you talk about, for example, a road trip or a narrative where the sequence really, especially in the case of a narrative, that should build up to this climax event of the story. Well, then you have to be very aware that you allow the viewer to follow the sequencing in such a way that they understand where you're going with the climax, and that they read the climax as such. So in that sense, the sequencing can be very crucial in developing your story. So it really depends. I know that's a kind of a weak answer to give and may not be very helpful, but it really depends on the story format that you choose for the story that you want to tell.
And I think also when you talk about the different ways of doing the editings, as you showed us briefly in your presentation, is it, as a photographer, I'm just curious, do you think it's important to kind of know in advance before you start a project or a story, what is this story going to be in the way of how am I going to edit it at the end? I mean, there's a big difference between like, I just remember myself being in Georgia many years ago during a Russian invasion in Georgia, and I came back with a lot of reportage pictures and other pictures I've been shooting all the time. And one editor sat down with me, went through the pictures, and I had this idea of like reportage style story. He just throw almost everything away and ended up with like images of bombed out houses, very like more, how to say it, pictures of houses in a way.
And, like a typology almost.
Yeah. So he did like a total different edit that I had in my mind, and so how is it for photographers? You think, is it important to know this in advance, or is this something you also can look for when you start editing your work? Like, is there different ways of editing my project, or should I go just in this one direction?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, because I think every photographer will have their own method of shooting. I think it can be very helpful to at least consider the platform where you want to show the work, and the kind of images you need to tell the story. Because if you shoot reportage style images, as you say, you will be able to create a visual essay, perhaps a narrative, which works really well in a magazine or in a newspaper. But it might not work very well on the walls of a museum, because in a museum there is less linearity. The sequencing kind of breaks up. It's harder to follow the routing. The images need to be bigger. So a portfolio presentation or a typology presentation might actually be more fit for a museum wall. And if you know in advance that you want this project to go on a museum wall, you might want to consider that you also need those kind of photographs. That I think it can be very useful. For example, you went to Georgia, right? There was an invasion. You shoot reportage, and indeed, it can be very interesting to also look for typology type pictures, moments, elements that can be told in a typology way. Bombed out houses, maybe broken trees, all those elements that tell the story or a part of the story in a different way. And then within the project, you can actually tell different stories, but also you can use different platforms. Because one thing that I haven't mentioned is that in these 11 formats, not all the formats fit on all the platforms. As I say, a visual essay is amazing for magazines like Life magazine. We have to realize that Life magazine went bankrupt in 1972. We don't have that kind of platform anymore, or at least not a lot of them. There are some. So the visual essay is a great format. I love it, but where can you publish it? There's no room in most newspapers. I know Fiji's might be the newspaper that you edit might be slightly different, but we don't have a lot of those newspapers. We don't have a lot of those magazines. But a visual essay doesn't really work in a book format anymore. we need a different kind of approach for book formats, which is often narrative or portfolio. So it is worth considering, I think, how you want to tell the story and for which platform you are creating your images.
And that's also, I think, when you see, very often you can see a book, the work in a book, but you also see it in a museum or in a gallery, and you also see that work may be presented online in let's say Time magazine online, something like that. So I mean, all these different ways of editing and thinking about editing that you presented, you also have to have that in mind, if I understand you correctly, when you look through your work, that you might end up editing this work in 3 very different ways, depending on where you're going to show it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you are able to take control over that as a photographer, then you also have control over how your work is seen. I mean, I've worked at an agency many years ago in France, and so often we had photographers rushing into the office complaining, oh, the editor made a completely wrong decision. They took the wrong edit. They didn't understand my story. And I'm sure you have this experiences too, both as an editor as well as a photographer. And at the same time, I was surprised, like, okay, but you were the one who gave out the first edit. So, these pictures were in your edit. So somehow you can't just blame, they didn't come up with new pictures. Huh? So it's also a way of taking control over how the story should be told and can be told. I think it's something that photographers do have some kind of influence, not total, of course. In the end, the editor makes their decision. That's true, but you have a certain kind of control over it, I think.
Yeah. Okay. We have a lot of questions, so I have to go through them.
Okay.
This is from Gaurav Datta. Hi, Mark. Thank you for your very useful talk. Can you also please go a little bit into how to merge different styles, I guess, in photography? Thank you, from North Dakota.
Okay. Well, different styles. I would be, to be honest, of course, break the rules and defy conventions, of course. But I would be hesitant with mixing different styles. I'm not sure if again, styles can be interpreted in many different ways. But photographic style is a bit like the language you use. You shoot in black and white, or you shoot in color, or you shoot very vibrant, or you shoot more snapshotty or very formal. In a way, it's the language that you use. And I think if you approach photography as a medium, you want to reach your audience. You want your audience to go along with you. And if you mix different styles, you might confuse the audience. I mean, I'm Dutch. I speak more languages, but I only speak one language at a time. And it would be very confusing for a lot of people if I start mixing up languages all of a sudden. Or if we're presenting this as a webinar and we're making it slightly formal and I'm explaining stuff from what I've learned and you're asking me the questions. If we would suddenly flip this around and use a completely different style where I start dancing, or people would get confused because they don't understand what they're looking at. So I think mixing different styles there's a risk involved that you lose your audience. So yes, it's possible. And I don't know if you know the movie From Dusk Till Dawn from Quentin Tarantino. It starts like a road movie, and then suddenly it turns into a horror, and a weird kind of horror for that matter. And of course, so it's possible to mix these kind of different styles. But then again, Quentin Tarantino is quite a good director, so he's able to pull it off. I mean, you have to be aware of the risk that you run when you break those kind of rules.
And I just wonder, because of course now we talk about editing pictures, but I guess also very often text is a quite important part of at least a lot of photo essays and other ways of showing photography. And do you see text? How important do you look at text in an editing process? Like, do you do you take that into consideration when you do and look at edit, or do you do that after you kind of select the pictures and build up a kind of a structure?
Well, again, it depends on the story, of course. But I think for me, photography can never exist without context. And I know that there are some books by photographers without any text, but even then there is a context. There's the context of the book. There's the context of, so I think it's always important to add text, to add explanation to it, again, to help. And it doesn't mean that you have to explain everything in words. That's also a decision by you as the maker of the work. But I think text is really important to contextualize and to show the viewer, to allow them to understand what it is they're looking at. But it's this, I showed these three words of content, context, and structure. And I think in a way it's deciding whether you need the words and are they part of the content? Are they crucial? And what words are crucial to really understand what we're talking about? Or are they part of the context? Mm-hmm. And sometimes the context is a background essay on the history of this area or person that you photograph. Well, then that's context, and that is important, but it doesn't have to be presented very prominently in the book. It can be in the back, it can be calm, it doesn't have to be. But sometimes, some works, you need a lot of text because the photographs themselves don't actually tell the story. So then you have to, the text becomes content next to the photographs. In a visual diary, that's often the case. There's often written diary entries to contextualize and to show what, the often, hard to read photographs actually mean, or what emotion they should convey. That doesn't mean that those books are less interesting or that the photography is less good, but it means that the content is actually built by the photographs and the text. And in that case, yeah, it's really important that you consider in your editing what text is related to the images and how they connect, and then eventually how they come together within the design. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And there's also another question from Gaurau Data. It's how do you merge why it matters to you and why it matters to the audience?
I don't know if you should merge it. But if you really, for example, I think if you as a maker and you're telling your own stories, so it's really about if you're creating your autonomous narrative and it's not an assigned project, it's not applied photography, but it's really your work. I think in applied photography, you do the job and you offer what your client wants, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But in autonomous photography, if you're building your own project, if you don't even care, right? If it doesn't really matter to you, then you're never going to be able to get that across to your audience. How to merge that? I don't really know. It really depends on the subject matter, of course. But I think it's important to realize that you can never talk to the whole world. There's always a segment of everybody that is or should be interested in your message or what it is you want to say. And what I advise photographers often is don't look for your audience. Identify why it matters and why you think it's important, why it should matter to other people. And then identify the platforms that agree with that message. So for example, it's a very obvious example, but if you talk about the environment, well, you can try to build your own network and look for environmentally concerned people, or you talk to Greenpeace. And if you can make that match with Greenpeace, they will reach out to their audience. Or just make sure that you keep out sending your message in a very consistent and a very comprehensible way. People will eventually hear you. If that's a very sustainable business model, that's another matter. But if it's about reaching an audience and marrying your concern with that of others, being truly honest to yourself, okay, this really matters to me, but should it matter to others as well? What is in it for them? Why should they care? Those are really important questions to answer, to make that bridge between yourself and your audience.
Yeah, and don't you also think that, in a way, if it's important for you as a photographer, it's in one way also important for the audience, as you say, not to everyone, because that's impossible. You will not reach out to everyone, but you work on a project that is about flooding, and of course it will be important for quite a lot of people, even though it's you that think this is important in the beginning, in a way.
Yeah.
So they might also just mix up by itself, because it's important for you. It's also going to be important for a lot of other people, I guess.
True. But I mean, but some questions, some projects are more personal, and then it's like, okay, but how does this relate? And then it's also about being honest to yourself and you know, confront the beast and say, okay, but why should it actually matter to others, or is this just my own therapy or my own way of dealing with things? Which is, there's nothing wrong with that, but then maybe it's not so interesting or valuable for an audience.
Randy Brown is asking, how important is it to ask for feedback from other professionals in project content and design? How much is too much feedback, in a way?
When is it too much for you? When it drives you crazy? I guess. No, I think it's really important to get feedback, but I think it's important to get feedback from people that you really trust, and that are able to give you the right kind of feedback. It's in people who I think it's really important. I think it's really valuable to come up with a group of people to share work amongst each other. But when I teach, I try to teach my students ways of giving feedback by asking questions. It's when people give feedback, they often give their own opinion. I think this is a very pretty picture. I remember going to this place and seeing this. But is that the kind of feedback that will help the maker? Or is it, can you help that person better by asking the right question? Because giving the gift of a good question it's an amazing thing to receive, being given a good question. Why did you go there? What did you see? What did you feel? How does this work? Open questions, because you're getting the person asking the question is not there to kind of satisfy their own curiosity, but is there to help the thought process of the other person move along. So if you can find people that are able to confront you with these kind of questions, and they don't need to be photography professionals or editing professionals, but they need to be honest and open and curious in one way, but they shouldn't be there to satisfy their own curiosity or to tell their own, to share their own experience. They should be there to trigger your thought process. Why did you do this? Why is this important? Why are you using this word? How come you went there and not there? I mean, those kind of questions, open questions that cannot be answered by yes or no, are really good ways to get the feedback process going. So yes, but with the right people, I would say.
Thank you. Daniel Schwartz is a fellow photographer in Seven, has a question. He says it will be interesting to know what particular books and exhibitions you refer to, which have kind of led you to your method and conclusions. Maybe not all of them, but do you have like some examples that you find that was good for your study?
Yeah. So for example, Permanent Error by Peter Hugo, a story in Ghana about wasteland of Western electrical junk, is a really great example of a portfolio. Tim Hetherington's Infidel, a book that's no longer available, but of an American platoon in the Corango Valley, is an amazing example of a narrative. For example, the Americans, as a road trip, but I think there's Alex Soth's work, is most of it is are actually road trips. So there's a lot of examples, and I've during the pandemic, in fact, I created a series of webinars on photo books where I try to identify, where I kind of start identifying these different formats. And in those webinars, you can actually see, I think in total, I discussed 60 or 70 books. But I give quite a lot of examples of, okay, so this I think is a visual diary, this I think is a portfolio, this I think is a typology. So that could be a good resource to look for if you want to know how I came up with these 11 formats. And in the booklet itself, there's also some examples, but they kind of came behind after the project. I was supported by the For HANA Foundation in writing this. So I've used images from their collection to kind of illustrate the different formats.
Thank you.
Laia Abril, for example, is a great example of visual research, for example.
Michelle Marazia is asking, what do you find more important between good quality of image editing or the quality of the story as a whole?
I think they're inseparable. I think a good edit can actually tell an amazing story. I think they should go together. There is no choice between these two. And if you would ask me between the most beautiful photographs and the best edit that tells a story, the answer is clearly the best story and not the best photographs. But that was not the question.
And it's also questions, she's also asking, how do you define if a story is interesting enough for your audience?
Yeah, in a way you cannot. And I think it's what somebody, it's asking feedback. The people, let's say your first, the people around you, your friends, your family, your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, brother, sister, mom, dad, uncle, grandparents. Talk to them, share your story. And if they are interested, well, then maybe you can go to your brother's friends or your classmates, people who are a bit further away from you. Are they interested? Do they care? Do they think that there is a spark in your story? And I think it's really an important thing that we can learn from the movie industry, for example. In the movie industry, nothing is being done until the money is raised, right? I mean, nobody shoots a film and then starts looking for the money. But it also means that apparently there's an audience, apparently there is an interest. In photography, a lot of photographers pick up a camera, go work 2 months, 3 years, 10 years, then come back and then try to look for an audience. And then they realize that nobody's interested in their work and they get very frustrated, understandably. But you can also, before you go, try and test the waters. Call an editor, maybe a publisher, a gallery curator, I don't know. Hey, I'm thinking about this story. What do you think? Is it worthwhile? Should I do this? Would you mind? And they might not give you a guarantee, but if they're honest people, and let's assume for now, for the sake of argument, that they're honest and say, yeah, no, this is a good story. I think I'll be interested. Or are they going to say, no, sorry, we've had 20 stories from that place and, we don't really, we don't want to post it anymore. So preparing that part, preparing the audience part, and let's say the platform part of your project before you go out and shoot is also a really good advice in this case, because otherwise you want to test the ground, you want to test the waters.
Thank you. And Ted Ostrowski is asking, I think he is asking, when is a story told without all the images you love? And I think it seems like he thinks about, the kill your darlings aspect of editing. And how do you know that the story now, this is it?
Yeah, you never really know, I think. It's but yeah, you have to kill your darlings. let me put it this way. When I work with the photographer and we have the edit on the table here, and okay, this is it. We figured it out. These are the 20 images that we're going to put up in the exhibition. There's always this last moment where the photographer's, yes, but I have this image. Can we use it? Because it's my favorite image. And there's different, sometimes, for example, I remember a case, I was working on a book and there was a picture of a horse in there, and the photographer came up with another pictures of that same horse. And I was like, yeah, of course. Doesn't change the story. You prefer that horse? Hey, be my guest. We put in that horse. And sometimes it's like, okay, but this image tells a different story. This image breaks up the sequence. It doesn't communicate what we agreed you wanted to communicate. If you put in this image, it will actually tell a different story, which is fine. It's your story, it's your decision, but then you're telling a different story. Often the photographer will say, okay, I understand. Oh, and then they print it very beautifully and put it in a frame and hang it above their bed at home, which is fine. But you never really know. But I think working with somebody to help you critically reflect on, okay, if this is the story you want to tell, what does this image do? Does it actually tell the story, or will it change the reading or the understanding of the story? That may be that's something that I think is really important to take into account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it, let's see, oh, there's a lot of questions. Yeah, this is from Therese. Do you have any thoughts about like references, pagina, title, info about each image close to an image, or all put together at the end of a book or at the end of a presentation? Do you have, I guess this is really hard to kind of give an advice on when you don't see the project or you don't see the pictures and you don't know the text, but in your experience going through a lot of photo books, I guess, and projects, do you have any opinion on what works?
There's not one way of doing it. Every project is indeed different, and I think it's a realization: is your text context or is your text content? And if, as a rule of thumb, and of course there's many exceptions to this, is not even a rule, but you could consider if the text is content, then it has to be with the image and it has to be quite prominent. If it's merely context, if the reading of your photographs, you don't actually, I mean, it helps the reading of the photographs, it supports it, but you can actually understand the story without it, then it's context, and it could work in the back of the book as part of reference. But I think it's this realization, what is the story you want to tell? And how are you telling it? What are the elements that make up the content of your work? Is it only images, or is it images and text, or is it? I mean, for example, right now in the Netherlands, we have Kadir van Lohuizen, who made a big exhibition on food for thought. It's called on food production. And the content of his work is not merely visual. There's a lot of technical information about how many kilometers foodstuffs fly, the production value, the number of people working in it, their daily salary. So, and those are crucial elements to understand what he wants to say, right? To indicate how our food system currently works. So it's both in the book as well as in the exhibition. That information is put up very prominently. It's not a visual story in that sense. That, again, I'm not saying that makes it a good or bad, but it's a different kind of story because the content is made up by these amazing visuals, but you can only read them, understand them properly with the right technical information, which is text, sometimes graphics and graphs. And he realized that, I think, and really put it together. So the content in this case is made up by the images as well as the text. And with The Americans by Robert Frank, it's a road trip. It doesn't really matter the information. There's a text in the beginning, there's some text in the end. The images tell the story. The images in themselves take you through. You only need to know a little bit about the era, what Frank was looking for, the social political situation in the States at that time, and that will allow you for a correct within brackets, of course, reading of that story. And you don't need the explanation that this is in New York and that's in Baltimore. It can help, but it won't fundamentally change your reading, what the name of the people in the picture is, or what they're actually doing. Oh, he's sitting in a bus. Okay, well, yeah, we see that. And the bus was going from here to there. It's not relevant information. It's only the visual sequencing that tells that story. So these are two very different kind of examples. The road trip, in the case of Van Lohuizen, I would call that a visual research. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Eric Matthew is asking or commenting on this, and he's saying he thinks this is an interesting challenge, that with work that is based on social issues is how to get it to audiences that aren't already aligned with those social issues. Preaching to the choir, as my father would call it, is having people who are already aligned with or aware of the issue at hand. But reaching people who could be impacted by the work in a meaningful way means getting into audiences who aren't aligned with it. I think he's saying something about a very challenging topic. It might have been easier when you reach out with photography in big magazines that had circulation of 1 million or 2 million or 3 million. Today, it's very different. Very often, if you share on social media, you are within this kind of, your work often reach out to the people who are interested in the same things as you. You know, in a gallery, you will probably reach out to most of the people who would be interested in the same things as you. So how do you get through to those people who actually need to see your work?
Yeah, unfortunately, and that may be the for me the easy way out right now. But that's not a question of editing. That's a question of platforms, and that's a challenge that we're up against as an industry, where our industry has really fundamentally changed, right? I mean, we used to have a lot of platforms available for photography, but those platforms are no longer available. And new platforms have come up on digital, social media, screens everywhere. And I think it's one of the challenges is to identify new ways of storytelling, new ways of editing, also to reach to be able to use those platforms to tell those stories to the right or different or new or concerned or unconcerned audiences. That is a major challenge, and I think it's important to identify how we can tell stories in ways that we can reach new audiences. Because indeed, but otherwise you'll be preaching to the choir. But I think it's important to realize that, for example, the visual essay, which is again an amazing format, but it does not work online. It does not work on social media. On social media, the continuous story, typology, and portfolio are, I think, more effective ways. You can still build a story. There's still consistency. For example, advertising photography. A lot of advertising photography, those big billboards you see on the side of the road, they are, for these big companies selling kind of products, they are often portfolios. It's in the same style, it's the same message, but photographed in a very consistent way, but each time showing a different aspect of that same story or of that same product or of that same lifestyle. It's a very effective way of keeping your audience involved, and it's not documentary, it's not for a concerned audience, but it is for an audience. You have to realize advertising is also a type of photography that is aimed at people who are not interested. It's aimed at people who don't want to buy that perfume or that suitcase or drink that soda. But they are created so that you become concerned, that you want to start drinking that soda because it looks very refreshing and cool or whatever. But just repeating the same picture over and over again is not going to work, but it needs to be recognizable. So the photographic signature of those images is very consistent. The style is the same, but each time a different aspect of the refreshingness of that soda will be exemplified. Once it's in the context of the beach, once it's in the context of the gym, once it's in the context of eating dinner at home. But the style and the approach will be very similar, so you, as a viewer, you recognize it. So that's one way that I think photographic stories told through portfolios can actually be very effective also in social media. I don't know anything about algorithms and all those kind of things, so I'm not an expert on that, but I do see in my own timeline that I recognize typologies, that I recognize portfolios. But when somebody tries to show me a visual essay, after 2.5 seconds, which is very long on social media, I've given up and I moved on to the next post. So, and this may be anecdotal evidence, and I have not researched this. I don't actually know, but there are different platforms, need different editing, need different visual formats, and hopefully one of these 11 that I've identified can help photographers to make the match. But it's a trial and error thing, and it's a challenge we're up against as an industry, and I don't have the answer, unfortunately.
Okay, this is Paolo from Italy. He says, once Jerome Cecchini said portfolio reviews are more of a conversation rather than a presentation. And I guess the same applies to working through editing as a photographer with a professional editor. What would be your advice to a visual storytelling rookie student when it comes to how to approach, as a new beginner, editing process together with someone else, like an editor, or and you are not that
be honest and open and approach it as a conversation. Come in with an open mind, be open to advice, be open to different approaches, and realize that it's about the story you want to tell, and not it's not about getting the recognition that you made beautiful pictures, but it's about the impact you will be able to make when the story is published. So I think when I work with photographers, an open, honest conversation where I can say, this is not a good image, we're not going to use it. And the photographer can say, but Mark, this is a really important image because this and this reason. That's the kind of conversation you need to have. So I think that openness and honesty are really crucial elements, just as in the portfolio review, in fact.
This Neely Drown is asking, how do you know when you are done making images and need to move on to the next phase? Is there a good question to ask yourself to help you decide when it's time to stop or to start editing?
Oh, wow. Espen, you might be the better person to answer that question. I am not a photographer. I've never worked as a photographer. I've never found myself in that situation. At the same time, it's why I think preparing almost a shoot list, if you know what story you want to tell and how you want to tell it, you should have a pretty good inkling. Did you find all the elements? If you just go around taking random shots and taking the right, if you don't go prepared, I think, of course, if you're experienced, it will work in a very different way. But if you are this rookie photographer, and I don't know if you are, but if you are a rookie photographer, you've never done this before, you will react to the situations that you find, which means that you are likely to take the right photograph for the right situation. But that means that you're not actually in control of your photography. It's the situation that decides the kind of image you're making. And it's a matter of claiming the authority or claiming the autonomy. You're in charge of your photography. And that means that, okay, this is a great visual situation, but I'm not going to take it because it's not part of the story I want to tell, or it's not part of my narration. But that thing happening while I was shooting this, but that happened, is actually part of my narration. And knowing which elements you need to tell the story. And of course, photography is about reality. Photography, you know, situations always change and are always adapted. So I'm not claiming that you know you go into a story not looking around you, but if you are well prepared, you will be able to identify, okay, now I have the elements that I need to tell my story eventually. And yeah, you, especially the first few times, you might not have it all, and you might have to go back. So my advice is, don't travel to the other end of the world. CO2 impact is too heavy. Shoot your stories in your own backyard. Look for them. They are sure to be there. I hope that answers the question.
There's several people asking if you could post links to the where they can find your book, and also to the PDF if it's possible. There's many. If you could do that in the chat.
Yeah, I will do that in the
so
chat.
people can find it. Would be great. We're getting close to the end now. I have a question, because for me as a photographer and also as a photo editor, everything has moved away from print. I don't edit anything for print anymore. I don't do any. We have a magazine, but it's just there on its own. It has no. We don't use any resources on the magazine. What we do is we edit and publish stories online, which is a very different way of showing images, because, and especially on mobile phones, where 90% of all consumers see pictures on mobile phones, meaning that you see one image at a time. In a magazine, you could see a spread, or you could see 5-6 pictures together. It was a very different way of thinking about editing. Do you have any ideas or ways of thinking when it comes to editing, especially for like online media, like maybe not Instagram, because that's basically like 6, 7, or 8 or 10 pictures on top of each other and you scroll through them. But on, let's say, New York Times, for example, and they're going to present a story that's going to have 15, 20 pictures. How do you think when you only are able to show one picture at a time, and how do you manage to keep? Is it important that they are connected to each other, or is it not, because it's a very different way of seeing pictures?
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult question to answer, of course, and I think we as an industry, we would need to do much more research in how this works, and also in audience interaction. What are the different formats that, and I think at the New York Times, for example, they will have this kind of research available, but they don't make it available to independent researchers like myself. So what is the audience interaction? How can you influence that, and what works better? I think that a good story is consistent, coherent, and has continuity. So that it's consistent in style, or consistent in quality, coherent in style, and has continuity in the story. That there is a logical sequence from one image to the next. That and that can be done through a narrative. It can be done through a portfolio or a typology, depending on the kind of story you want to tell. Some stories are best told in a typology. There's just, if you want to show that all the houses that the destruction in Georgia is, for taking your example that you gave earlier, yeah, I think it can make a lot of sense to use a typology of houses that are burned out, for example. But it can also make sense to follow the story of one person struggling to make their daily life. But you don't want to photograph that as a typology. You want to photograph that as a narrative. But it implies as a photographer that you have the images that can tell the narrative. So you need an establishment shot. You need enough development shots. You need the shot that actually has a climax. And we need to realize, or ask ourselves, are we telling a visual story, or are we telling a story in text? And do we use the images to illustrate the text? Is the content built by the images, or is the content built by the images and the words? Because that changes the entire game of how you sequence and how you bring things together and what your expectations are of the audience. But that's a very technical discussion. I don't have the actual answer. I wish I did, but I think there are possibilities. But it would be very interesting to look at the data generated by your audience and the amount of clicks and the amount of time that they spend, and test it out. Okay, we have this story, we do it like this. We have this story, we do it like that. Let's see what happens. It would be an amazing test case to see if what that gives. And I'm not aware of any of those publicly available researches at this moment. If anybody knows of them, I'd be more than happy to hear and read them. It's not really an answer to your question, no, sorry.
No, but it's a challenge, as you say. I think it's a challenge that we are just at the beginning of it, and also that the technology is running so fast. It's if we get up with a perfect way of showing photography online, for sure there's going to be a different way, different phone or different system to watch it, and then you have to reinvent everything once again. So that's how it works these days, I think. But we've been talking for 1 hour and 15 minutes, and I think we're gonna wrap it up now. I want to thank everyone. It was around 90 people here watching your insights, Mark.
Great.
It's good. And
thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you for joining and sharing your thoughts and ideas, and also maybe helping some photographers who are stuck in editing process. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and so I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you for coming, Mark.
Great. Thank you very much for your attention and your questions, and until we meet again online or offline. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.